don't look now, but Hollywood's corporate greed and bankruptcy of new ideas, creative endeavor to repackage every animated film into live action version, is now spreading beyond the borders of Disney Studios, because 15 years after the smash hit original, Universal is now giving How to Train Your Dragon a similar treatment. Will a different studio be able to succeed where Disney has often failed? I have seen it, so let's talk about it. So the fact that a How to Train Your Dragon theme park just opened a couple weeks ago demonstrates just the immense popularity of these movies. I think the animated series is arguably among the best of the genre, and at least in my eyes, they're up there with something like the Toy Story franchise as far as just consistent quality, and that has made me sort of equal parts interested and anxious for this live action version. But I can come to you as the bearer of good news because I actually think this is one of the most enjoyable live action adaptations to date. I think despite the unavoidable stigma of just being told the same story twice, How to Train Your Dragon is a live action remake done right. I think an enjoyable and faithful reimagining that does capture the heart of the original, even if not all of its charm. Now, I think films should be evaluated on their own merit, but these live action remakes obviously don't exist in a vacuum. I think a large part of what does make them either enjoyable or cringeworthy is sort of that exercise of comparing them to the animated originals. And while most of the Disney remakes were enjoyable, really only so far as their nostalgic connection to the better animated versions, I think this How to Train Your Dragon remake would be a good film, even in the absence of any nostalgia for the animated original. I think the original animated version does remain superior, but had this live action version released first, I think it may well have spawned its own successful franchise. I think it's definitely a different experience, but for once, different does not have to be synonymous with bad or soulless. Of course, the extent to which this new film actually is a different experience is somewhat debatable, because it may not be a shot-for-shot remake, although at times it does come close, but at the very least, it's a beat-by-beat retelling. Some differences are unavoidable. Characters now look like real people and not just cartoons, but for better or worse, and I'm personally inclined to think better, this is the same story that audiences know and love, just reimagined with a new aesthetic. I think some audiences may bemoan just the complete lack of surprises or any semblance of risk taking, but I also suspect that many others will just appreciate this film's willingness to not try and fix what isn't broken. And returning elements from the original may establish an unfavorable comparison at times, but they also remind viewers of why the original was so highly regarded. For one, the return of the original's fantastic soundtrack works almost as some sort of cheat code, really infusing the film with this irresistible sense of adventure. And the music in this movie is just so good. But perhaps the more consequential return is Dean DeBlois, the writer and director of the animated original. And what makes it even more interesting, at least to me, is that sort of his only other notable directing credit is the animated Lilo and Stitch, which received its own live action treatment just last month, although without his involvement. And you can check out my full review of that film. But overall, I enjoyed that film for what it was. But I do know that some people felt that the story's alterations, particularly with the ending, were just somewhat inconsistent with the thematic heart of the original tale. I think in contrast, by bringing back the original creator, the How to Train Your Dragon remake just exudes a sense of love and respect for the original story, rather than ever coming across as some sort of worrisome attempt to deconstruct it. And the subtle changes that do work to align the story more with the so-called modern sensibilities, such as added diversity to the original's all-white cast, are given in-world explanations and do feel consistent with the thematic message, rather than feeling just pandering ideology, even if there is some brief dialogue about privilege that does come close. But I think most of this film's new narrative additions do add value to the story, because the increased runtime means there's simply more room to tell more story, allowing the film to deepen character motivations or fill out backstories values and give supporting characters an increased role. And at least to me, the additions feel like material that would have been included in the original had the runtime allowed it. In fact, I think if you haven't watched the original, in several years, you may struggle to even pinpoint what the additions are, since they do blend so seamlessly into the story. I should note too that the classic boy and his dog story remains largely unchanged, but the live action aesthetic does lend it a slightly more serious tone. I think some younger fans of the original movie may be pushed a little bit outside of their comfort zone, because no, this is not a Netflix style dark and gritty version, but the human drama just feels a bit more weighty, and the dragon fueled action just a bit more intense. Even so, I think despite the new look and somewhat sharper tone, the film still manages to convey the adventurous spirits and visual beauty of the original. I think the dragons, they look fine. They look about as convincing as a CGI creature feasibly can. But I think the real power of the visuals comes more in how they are used. Because scenes of Hiccup and Toothless soaring through the clouds, or over the lush landscape of Berk, are just a very immersive and thrilling cinematic experience. As far as kind of to consider things going on the surface of it, for language, really nothing here. There's a moment before a battle with the dragons where the Viking leader shouts at his warriors to send those devils back to hell. A character also says things bloody, or another that exclaims, for God's sake. As far as violence goes, like I mentioned, the action is more intense, when rendered into live action form. And there is the implication that both Vikings and dragons are, assumedly being killed in combat, although no deaths are ever depicted on screen. Although, like the cartoon, several characters do sport various artificial limbs. For sexuality, there is a returning joke brought over from the original about a pair of helmets being made from the breastplate of Hiccup's mother. There's also a scene which was shown in many of the movie's trailers, where upon seeing a miniature dragon, a character says, "It's about the size of my," before being interrupted, although his intended words seem clear. The only other kind of content thing to be aware of is that pagan religion and spirituality does play a bit more of a prominent role in this remake, because there's one scene where a character voices sort of a desperate prayer to Odin, and then in another scene, the village's spiritual leader woman casts bones on the table in order to try and discern the best course of future action. First themes, worldview, things going on beneath the surface. I think the remake explores, as you might expect, similar themes of empathy and reconciliation as the original animated version, but it does use its increased runtime, I think, to delve even deeper into those messages, because this film really explores the sinful human tendency just to look down upon and make inaccurate, hasty judgments towards that which we don't fully understand. And in many ways, the conflict between the humans and the dragons is really just an external reflection of the more personal disconnect between Hiccup and his father, who is, the gruff warrior Viking chief. Because in one of my favorite scenes, the father and son sit down to have a chat, only to quickly discover that they really don't seem to have much to talk about, kind of with the chasm between them almost as wide as sort of that between the humans and the dragons. And even Snotlout, who is Hiccup's chief rival, is presented, I think, more sympathetically in this version, because the film gives him more of a character arc, revealing how his insecurities or bully tendencies do stem from his upbringing and an affectionate father. And while the spirituality in the film may be pagan, I think the message is consistent with Christianity, because much of the biblical New Testament is given to instruction and exhortation for how Christians are to live among people, both within the church and outside of it, who do differ from them and who they may not fully understand. And I think that scripture has to repeatedly hammer home that point again and again, is just because that is a reality of life and it's not easy. And the film may present that process of reconciliation and unity in a very simplistic and streamlined manner, but I think the core message does remain very biblical and edifying. I think, and even on a broader cultural level, the message feels even more timely now than probably it did when the original film released. I'll add too that the film also has a dimension of a challenge for the youth to lead the way, similar to something in the Bible like 1 Timothy 4:12, because during a training session, the fiery young warrior Astrid says, "In case you haven't noticed, our parents' war is about to become ours." And yet it is ultimately the youth of Berk that lead the way towards peace and the end of the war, rather than just the continuation of it. So, in the end, How to Train Your Dragon, I think Swords is one of the best remakes in years. I think, well, Disney may have tested audiences' patience with its series of very uninspired reimaginings. Universal breathed some new life into the whole remake project, but hopefully not too much life because I really don't need to see a live action Kung Fu Panda. But does Hollywood need to remake every animated film? No, absolutely not. But I do think, like, if such films are going to be remade, then if nothing else, How to Train Your Dragon just shows how to do it right. But hey, I would love to hear what you think. If you enjoy the original, if you're cautious about this, if you're just tired of all these remakes in general, or fall somewhere in between, don't be shy. Jump into the comment section. Let's have a conversation about it. If you haven't done so too, I encourage you guys, subscribe to the channel, become a Collider, because that's over there. Movie reviews, got our Faith and Pop Culture podcast, got interviews, just other fun stuff. Would love to have you guys be a part of that. Most of all, guys, thank you for watching. Stay safe and continue to collide through the world for Christ.